Get ready to enter a brave new world with your host, Vasant Dar.
We are at a pivotal moment in the history of the internet. Will it evolve into a platform that enhances individual freedoms or curtails them through greater surveillance? The outcome will depend on choices we make around its design and use of data, so we'd better make them wisely. China's model, for example, is largely a command and control one. On the other extreme is what I call the US Wild West model, which is a land grab of data by big tech to fuel its ad-driven business model. Europe wants something in between, a free market model that preserves privacy. India's model focuses on creating a public data infrastructure, which has been driven by societal needs, like the need for inclusion of large numbers of people who didn't even have an identity. But more interestingly, India has laid out a vision of quote-unquote data empowerment, aimed at putting users in control of their data through explicit consent. It's an attempt to make the internet more egalitarian. Joining me today is Nandan Nilekani, who needs no introduction in India. For people tuning in from other parts of the world, Nandan is the architect of the world's largest biometric real-time authentication system called Aadhaar, which was rolled out in 2009 and has roughly 1.3 billion users. That's 1.3 billion users. He's shaped a number of national policy initiatives around the use of the internet in areas such as payments, and is actively involved in shaping India's consent-based use of data. Nandan is also the co-founder and chairman of Infosys Technologies Limited. He was the co-founding chairman of the Unique Identification Authority of India in the rank of a cabinet minister from 2009 to 2014. More recently, Nandan has co-founded XStep, a not-for-profit effort to create a technology-based platform to improve literacy and numeracy for millions of children. Nandan, welcome to Brave New World. It's been a long time, and I'm very much looking forward to this conversation.
Thank you, Vasant. Great to be on your show.
So, I usually start by asking people to tell us something about themselves. You're a public figure, but, tell us something that most people don't know about you.
Well, I think hard for that, but yes, one thing is that, which I haven't really told anyone, is that the first day I came to IIT Bombay in 1973, I just felt incredibly lonely that day. And I said, my God, what have I come to and how will I manage? And I was quite shaken. But I think by the end of it, I was able to figure out how the game was. So I think in that sense, the confidence I gained from IIT was something helped me all my life.
What else did you find interesting about IIT? One of the things I find with my guests is that we have the strangest things in common. And I realized that you and I both went to IIT.
In the same years, I think, 73 to 78, right?
Indeed. And my experiences, I guess, are similar. I went there from boarding school and suddenly I was surrounded by, my recollection of this is like, I felt pretty stupid. It's like everyone around me seemed smarter and sharper and everything. Yeah. And my question is like, what am I doing here? So I felt that sort of feeling of being a little overwhelmed by all these guys who were like super competitive and all of that.
Absolutely. I went through the same. That's what I said about feeling lonely, because I had come from a small town and I had somehow scrambled through the exam and got in, and I was wondering what I was doing. And, I was meeting all these sophisticated guys and who talked amazing stuff. And I was really feeling overwhelmed and, wondering, like, what the hell am I doing here? But it took me some time to figure it out. But yes, that was definitely my starting feeling.
I guess another thing that we have in common as sort of a life experience is that we've gone from technology of zero to something pretty amazing where we are now. We actually spent a lot of our growing up years in zero tech, literally zero tech, to the extent that we used computers. They were for solving, finally for solving complex differential equations, something mundane like that. It reminds me of like a Jerry Garcia line, what a long, strange trip it's been from zero tech to high tech. And what's amazing about this also, and especially talking to you, is that you've been a visionary in the tech space, right? So given that we started with zero tech, it's kind of interesting that you've been someone in the space who's had this vision of how to address large-scale societal problems using digital platforms.
Well, Vasant, I think actually coming from zero tech actually helps in this regard, because then you can take a long view of where tech is going. I was just thinking about your question, and I had a TV at home only at the age of 16. So my zero tech included no television. So television at the age of 16 was the first time I had a TV at home. And I had my first smartphone in my 50s. So clearly, and so did you, I guess, because the smart came after we were 50 plus. I think, therefore, the ability to step back from tech and take a view of where tech is going, and not really, using the device and constantly being on some social media and all that. I step back from this stuff, and that helps me to think about the trend lines of technology and how we can participate in that. So I guess, in some sense, I really pity people who are born and are playing with their phones at the age of 3, because they'll never experience what life is like without this stuff, which I think is very important, actually. But we are the bridge generation. I agree.
Yeah, we are. My kids grew up with tech, and I talked to my students. In fact, I went out for a drink with them last night after a semester of online teaching. After the last class, we actually went out for a drink, and it was
physical drink or virtual?
No, like a physical drink. We went
Wow.
to a bar down on Bleecker Street, and a bunch of them showed up. The local people showed up. It was like, just a whole other experience, right? And they all told me how they really miss that face-to-face aspect. There's some great things to be said about virtual and all that kind of stuff, but at the end of the day, there's little substitute for that direct human experience.
So maybe in some way the pandemic will make us treasure the human experience. Having satiated ourselves with this virtual world, I think we'll go back to enjoying these physical meetings we're going to have. I'm certainly looking forward to going to a jazz bar in downtown New York with you.
Indeed, I look forward to that. I was actually looking forward to coming to India this summer, for my usual trip and visiting you guys in Bangalore. But
not advisable.
Given the way things are, I don't think that's happening. Nandan, talking about tech and the fact that you've been a visionary in this space, tell us a little bit about how you think now about how the internet should be governed, the role of the internet in people's lives. You've been the architect of the Aadhaar platform, which we can come back to later. But I just want to start with your thoughts now, 12 years after that platform was rolled out. The world has changed. We sometimes forget that Facebook only went public 8 short years ago, and Google, 15, 16 years ago. So not that long ago. And yet we've learned so much about the wonders of the internet and the wonderful things it can bring, but also sort of the dysfunctionality of it and some of the risks that it poses to society, to democracy. What are your overall thoughts now, given where we've been, about internet governance?
Well, I don't know about governance, that's a big word, but the way I think about the internet is really, I think of it in 3 stages, Vasant. I think the first stage I would call as the age of innocence. To a large extent, the early internet was driven by idealism, counterculture, interoperability, creating public good, and so on. And that age of the internet was from its inception, from the early days up till about the time, through the World Wide Web and the invention of the first browser with Mosaic. And then the second phase of the internet has been the age of commerce, when the private sector got involved heavily in the internet, and you saw the rise of companies, Google, Facebook, and so on, Amazon, and so on. And that was, say, starting in 95 when Netscape was launched, through maybe 4 or 5 years back. And I see the third stage of the internet is the age of geopolitics, because in this third stage, the internet has become so critical to countries and so much part of geostrategy that it's gone beyond commerce. It's about countries and how they view technology and how they view the internet as part of their overall the geopolitics. So I would say age of innocence, age of commerce, and age of geopolitics. Now, in the age of innocence, I think the governance was, at that time, it was basically a US government creation, and there were a lot of these bodies like W3 Consortium and others, and it was well managed. And then in the age of commerce, really, there was no governance as such, but these big tech companies became global players, and their technology became the technology of the world. So a kid in India, his first app would be WhatsApp or something like that. Except that the Chinese decided early, they realized that this was something they needed to have better control over. So they created the whole Chinese firewall, and then created domestic champions like Alipay, WeChat, and Baidu, and so on. And then this became so huge and so important and so became entwined with societies and the whole free speech and censorship and encryption and everything, that now it's totally entwined in individual countries. And countries are realizing that they need to exert more control over their version of the internet, which is why we have the so-called splinternet now, where different areas will have different versions of internet. So I think this has gone through a tortuous path of innocence, commerce, and now geopolitics.
So given this new age of geopolitics, do you see that we will splinter further apart with this splinter net? That is, we have these global models emerging. The US has kind of been Wild West, free-for-all commerce, do whatever you can, while you can, data land grabs, sort of a free-for-all, not surprisingly, given the free market nature of the US. And then you alluded to China, which is command and control. And then we have Europe with GDPR. And again, it is what you would expect from Europe. Tell us a little bit more about the thinking in India at the moment and how that is shaping infrastructure that will emerge there, and how are you thinking about it?
Well, I think, as I said, the commercialization of the internet began with the launch of Netscape in 95, and then all the other great companies came after that. But there were a couple of things which at that time were sort of gaps in the internet of that time. One was, of course, that there was no identity as such on the internet. So then the private companies started offering identity as a service. The second and more important thing was there was no business model for the internet. There was no way to do commerce. And that's how you led to the advertising model, which essentially, you showed ads to people. And the moment you start showing ads to people, you needed to know more about them so that you could accurately target those ads, which meant you had to collect data. And then you collected the data, and you collected the data around identity so that you had something about a person. And I think because of the lack of good micropayment system on the internet, it went more towards the advertising model. And the payments on the internet was really done by existing payment mechanisms. So we looked at this, not that we sat down and said, hey, there's this internet and we need to fix it. We didn't have any such grandiose ambition. We began the ID project not so much from the internet as to solve a domestic Indian issue, which was that many people were born who did not have birth certificates. Now, to an American, that doesn't make sense because 98% of births in America are registered at the point of birth, and the birth certificate becomes the root document of identity. So you use the birth certificate to get a driver's license or to vote or to get citizenship. In fact, you remember the whole debate on Obama's birth certificate. So birth certificate is the basic root document in the US or in any Western country where births are registered quite systematically at the time of birth. Now, in countries like India, and by the way, this is true not only of India, but many other developing countries, birth registration is not very robust. And even today, there may be states in India where more than half the babies born are not registered. So we had a situation in India where we had a few 100 million people who didn't really have a kind of a document about who they were. And this was all right in the good old days when you lived and spent your entire life in the same village. But as Indians started to migrate from rural India to urban India, from North India to South India, from East India to West India, and so on, the lack of a document, identity document, was actually a big bottleneck because they could not open a bank account, board a train, get a job, answer the question when the cops stopped them, and so on. And so there was a realization that you need to have, everybody should have some kind of an ID with them, which they can use wherever they are. And the second reason is that over the last 20 odd years, India began to build more of a welfare state and started allocating more money in the budget to giving payments to individuals, for example, pension payments or scholarship payments. And the lack of a robust way of identifying people and sending them the money didn't exist. which, by the way, is a problem even today in many Western countries. But anyway, in India, it didn't exist. So there was a need to have an ID for everyone so they could send them the money or the rice or whatever. And therefore, these were the two drivers, the need for inclusion of getting everybody some kind of an identity and the need to have a way of making welfare and other government payments more accurate and more efficient. What happened though is when I entered the scene and I took up this job, I quit my role as the co-chairman of Infosys in 2009 and joined the government of India in the rank of a cabinet minister as the chairman of a startup in the government called the UIDAI, which led to the Aadhaar work. We said, look, if you're going to build an ID platform in the 21st century, we should do it as a digital ID. A digital ID which is portable on the cloud so that wherever you are, you can use it, which you can authenticate online in real time and so on. So there, we brought out a bit of the thinking of platforms into ID. And that's what led to Aadhaar, which today has 1.27 billion people with a digital ID. They can authenticate it anywhere in the country on any phone. It does billions of transactions a month. Then you can use it to do a KYC or know your customer, to open a bank account. And the beauty of this is this ID is not collecting information about you. We were very clear in the design of the ID that this was not a data aggregating ID. So when you get an ID from a private company, that ID then is, the whole discussion on cookies and all that. So it is really, data is collected. That's part of the whole issue of privacy and surveillance and so on, right? So we designed it so that the ID system only authenticated that Vasant is Vasant. And where Vasant used it was up to him, and the ID system did not. So it was sort of an optimal ignorance kind of a model. So this kind of an ID, we think, is very important. So that was the first piece of the thing, which is ID. The second is going back to what I said, that commerce on the internet was not there. No, payment system was not there. So people tended to use advertising as a revenue model. So the NPCI, which is a fabulous payment company in India, it's a non-profit, which is collectively owned by the banks, worked and built this platform called UPI, Unified Payment Interface, which is a very modern, state-of-the-art micro-payment infrastructure, which is very high volume, very low cost, interoperable across multiple banks, multiple front-end consumer apps on phones. And it's very, very useful because now we have a very high volume, very low cost payment system, which is now making it very easy to do commerce on the internet. So, it's going from advertising more towards transactions. So in my view, India is going to be more of a transacting internet than an advertising-led internet, because advertising revenues in India are not very high. And the third and most strategic piece of the puzzle is how do we flip data and put it in the hands of individuals and small businesses. And that's the data empowerment architecture, which India has launched in the last 3-4 years. And this is based on the premise that rather than data be aggregated by companies or by governments, if data of the individual can be given back to the individual whenever he or she wants it in a secure manner so that they can put it to use for whatever they want, then we have fundamentally flipped data on its head. And this ability to flip data on its head so that individuals and businesses can use their own data, in some sense, is going to be the most profound contribution of India to the data debate globally, because it's clear that data is where all the issues are. And therefore, I think data empowerment is the third thing. So I think in some sense, this identity, micropayments, and data empowerment has created what we like to believe is a more inclusive internet, and has, in some sense, addressed some of the things which were left behind post-95, when the private sector essentially ran the internet and the role of the public bodies in the internet started to go down.
So what were the critical success factors? I was struck by what you said, which is that the identification, the authentication platform did just one thing. Are you who you say you are?
Yeah.
I guess in retrospect, that was great to keep things that simple, right? There was nothing else behind it. It just did that one thing.
Yeah.
And the motivation for that one thing was inclusion, to basically have people now have an identity that could be used in ways that would include them in society. And I guess what you're saying is that then became the bottommost layer of this infrastructure that you're describing. That is, if you actually want to do things at scale, then that ability for real-time authentication then facilitates things like micropayments, and it can actually facilitate this data empowerment architecture that you're talking about.
True, Vasant, but we didn't necessarily make it dependent in the sense that micropayments can work without Aadhaar and data empowerment can work without Aadhaar. We wanted to unbundle this and not connect it too much. I mean, it can work with or without, so we didn't want too much of dependencies. But the important thing is, and this is very important, we consciously chose a minimalistic design. And we said we'll only collect the minimum information to give somebody an ID. So we had a person's name, address, date of birth, sex, optionally email ID and phone number for communication, and the biometrics for deduplication, and nothing else. And believe me, that was a big natural tendency when you design systems is collect more and more data. So everybody said, look, you're going to go and meet 1 billion people. Why don't collect more information? Collect the blood group, collect this or collect that. We said, no, we don't want to do that. We want to have a very minimalistic system that only gives everybody an ID and gives them a way to authenticate that in any context that they have. And therefore, the discipline of minimalism was a very important discipline, and it's counterintuitive when you develop systems because everybody said, why don't you collect more data? I said, no, we don't want to collect more data. We want to keep it as simple as possible.
The minimal aesthetic has turned out to be a visionary one. Now, this data empowerment architecture that you're talking about, what are the risks that we get this wrong? Are we handing over a lot of power to people who design these systems and who understand technology? Are we sort of becoming overly reliant on people like that to solve problems of society?
No, we run the risk that if the people designing these systems don't design them the way they should, we could have a challenge. And I guess that's why a lot of the people who work with me in the last decade, a lot of thinking goes into that. How do we make it inclusive? How do we make it non-discriminatory? How do we make it accessible by the poor and so on? I mean, look, there's a risk, but the thing is that governments have great scope for doing bad things, but governments also have great scope for doing good things. I mean, at the end of the day, the internet itself is a creation of government. The internet was not created by some private sector hotshot. It was created by the US government, and they invested many years. DARPA and all that put in money, and science, NSF. All these guys invested, and that's how we got the internet or how we got GPS. So while we, celebrate the fact that you can tap on a phone and get a cab, below that is a lot of technologies that have been developed by government. So I think governments have great potential to do good as well as surveillance and so on. Fortunately, in India, while the awareness among bureaucrats and politicians is quite good, even the judiciary, I think, if you see the Supreme Court, which gave landmark judgments on privacy and so on, outstanding, absolutely outstanding. So in some sense, Aadhaar and the reactions to Aadhaar actually fast-tracked India into the digital age, in my view, because there was so much debate about it that everybody became a lot more cognizant of the possibilities and a lot more cognizant of the risks. So we saw in 10 years, or 2009 to 2019, I think India's digital awareness among its decision makers, its elites, changed dramatically.
Has anything surprised you during these 12 years?
What I've learned is that some things take time to deliver, and then when they start delivering, the delivery is like spectacular. It's instantaneous. We saw that with the direct benefit transfer program, which has Aadhaar linked to bank accounts, and governments can in real time transfer money into millions of accounts. This was very, very handy in the pandemic because the government wanted to send emergency funding to a lot of people who had gone back to the villages, didn't have any income. And they were able to do that in a day or two, which many more advanced nations grappled with. So you suddenly find that something that you had thought about 10 years back suddenly is becoming very useful, or how UPI payments have taken off. NPCI, to which I'm an advisor, launched UPI in May of 2016, and by October of 2016, it was only at 100,000 transactions a day. And then we had the whole demonetization and all that. And today UPI is doing about 2.7 billion transactions a month. And suddenly it pops up in the most unexpected places. The other day I was passing a coconut vendor in Bangalore, the guys who slice the top off and give you a straw and you drink a coconut. And he was saying, I accept Google Pay. I said, wow, we have really managed to get this stuff out there. So, when you see that, you feel pleased about it, saying that, a lot of what you thought about years back is finally fructifying.
Is there anything that keeps you up at night about things that could possibly go wrong? The reaction that people often have to anything quote unquote centralized is, like what happens if it gets hacked? What happens if you get like a rogue government that suddenly decides that, it's got this amazing surveillance possibility at its fingertips, right?
Yeah.
Does that kind of stuff keep you up at night?
Well, as I said, part of it was addressed in the design of it. One is not a data accumulator, so the data that it has is very simple. The data is not exposed on the internet. It's only used for enrollment and then put away offline, encrypted somewhere. The authentication is not done against the biometric, but against the minutiae of the biometric. And a whole host of things. The design is designed from day one not to even give it scope. And by law also, I think if you look at the laws, if you look at the Aadhaar law, you look at the Supreme Court judgment, you can't use the Aadhaar data for anything else. So, by law, the data is closed. So a lot of stuff in regulation, technology, and so on has been put in. Now, obviously, we have to safeguard against what you said. And the question is then, but do we do nothing then? I mean, that's the question is, what's the alternative, right? I mean, do you want a situation where everybody in India has got an ID from some other company and they're accumulating all the data? Is that what you want? So I think it's really a question of whenever we use digital technology, we are in some sense depending on either government or large companies. And anyone can be prone to abuse, right?
No, absolutely. I guess one safeguard would be some sort of a transparency, some policy around transparency, right? So to the extent that there's hacks or leaks or cases that we call edge cases or corner cases, that those things are documented, right? And immutable and visible to the public.
By the way, this applies to both public and private companies and public infrastructure,
Absolutely,
which is that if there is a hack, you have to, just like in the stock markets, if we have a material hack, we have to declare it to the market saying that you won a large deal or something else or the other. I think you need to have data transparency about hacks, no question about it. And then, of course, where AI is being used, fairness and all that stuff.
So I want to come back to the data empowerment architecture that you talked about and flesh it out a little bit more, because I remember there's a few terms that I actually picked up from you that I heard the first time, this notion of a data fiduciary that is similar to a financial fiduciary in principle, like that your obligation is to the creator of the data, that to avoid misuse. Say a little bit more about that. How has that concept sort of made its way into this data empowerment and protection architecture that you mentioned?
Yes, I think that's actually key to the architecture. I think what we understand about data is we understand that there will be entities or organizations that have a lot of data about an individual or business. For example, a bank has the bank statements and transactions of millions of people. The tax system has the tax payments and invoice details of millions of businesses. The e-commerce platform has all the transactions that you sell. So we know that there are going to be all these data sort of accumulated stuff everywhere. And we also know that there are going to be entities that would like to use this data to provide a service. So your bank would like to use the data to give you a loan. A wealth manager would like to use this data to recommend a mutual fund or whatever. So the first category, we call them as information providers. And let's take it specifically in the financial sector. They're called financial information providers. So these are people who have data about an individual, or so it could be a bank or a mutual fund, or it could be a tax authority or whatever. And then you have on the other side information users, and in the area of finance, it would be financial information users. This could be a lender, a wealth management, a personal finance app, it could be any of those things. And then, of course, you are there, you, the user, who is an individual or a business, whose data is sitting in these many data stores, and who wants to take the data and give it to one of these users to get a service from them. So broadly, we have financial information providers, financial information users, you, the citizen or consumer or small business. Now, the question is, how do you manage all this? And that is the extra thing that came out of the data empowerment architecture, which is somebody who we call as data fiduciary, but now we call them more as account aggregators, who sit, or consent managers, who manage the consent on behalf of the individual. So these are licensed guys who are basically act on your behalf. And so let me give you the workflow in the case of a loan. Suppose I am a small business. I want to take a loan. I will go to my consent manager and say, get my bank statement from this bank on my behalf. Get my tax returns from the tax authorities on my behalf. Get my invoice details from here on my behalf. And then that data on your behalf is brought by the fiduciary or the consent manager, but it's brought in a totally encrypted manner. So this consent manager cannot see the data. He just acts as the traffic cop to take the data from these various sources, and on your behalf gives it to one or more lenders, banks or non-banks, who then, with your permission, analyze the data and decide to give you a loan or not. So this notion of these consent managers or data fiduciaries or account aggregators is a whole new idea in the data business. And they are your representative. They are representing you. They cannot see the data. They have to only flow the data from provider to user. They also manage the consent you give. So you can tell the bank to which you're applying, saying, you can store my data and use this for this one purpose only, or you can keep it only for 1 week. So this programmable consent is actually a huge contribution that we have in our data empowerment architecture, which is, so this combination of the fact that individuals and businesses can use their own data to get services. And when they give the data to somebody to get a service, they can programmatically tell them how to use it. These are all innovations that don't exist anywhere else.
It sounds fascinating, right? That you can do this kind of stuff in real time with very little friction.
Yeah, real-time population scale, everybody can, billion people can participate, 10 million businesses can participate in microtransactions. Yeah, it's pretty unique.
Yeah, right. Mind-boggling when you consider the scale, but yet the simplicity of it. So where are we in this process? How long before we actually see this in reality?
Well, first of all, let me just step back and say that the architecture of this data empowerment is industry agnostic, in the sense this can be used for financial information, it can be used for healthcare records, it can be used for your skills records or your degree certificate. So it's agnostic to the use case. However, the first use case of it in the Indian context is in the financial sector. So there, our regulators have been very progressive in notifying this account aggregator. There are several account aggregators who have been licensed. Many of the banks and other data sources are coming on to this as financial information providers. COVID, in some sense, probably affected the rollout, but now I think in the next 2-3 months, you're going to see many financial information users giving loans to people using data that they provide. And we think that this, once we get this virtuous cycle going, then it will take off pretty fast. So I think it's taken us a long time because there's so many moving parts. There's regulation, there's licensing of these account aggregators, there's getting the banks on board, developing the tech so that it's robust, reliable, and encrypted. So many things to be done. There's a group called Sahamati, which is orchestrating this. It's really like a self-regulating organization of account aggregators who's doing a great job on this. So I think in the next year, and especially post-COVID, when the economic recovery starts, you will see a big takeoff of the account aggregator architecture in financial services. Now, once that is demonstrated, then it will happen in healthcare. So I will have the same command over my healthcare records, or it will happen in my job seeking, because I can get my degree certificate from here, I can get my skill certificate from here, show it to a potential employer. For example, if I'm a driver, I'm working with one mobility company and I have a good track record, I should be able to take that portability to another place to get a job. This unlocking of data and putting it in the hands of the individual or small business is actually an extraordinarily empowering thing which is being planned.
Indeed, it's a whole other way of looking at data. Can't wait to see how this actually pans out. So coming back to your three phases of the internet, you talked about the fact that we're now in this sort of geopolitical phase. And the way I sort of interpret a lot of what you're saying is that India's had this late mover advantage in a sense that, you could take stock of the situation 15 years into the internet and say, how can we use it for inclusion and getting people into the mainstream? So that was sort of a India-specific problem. But now we're seeing, I guess for lack of better term, jostling for power, right? So you have the Chinese state that I would expect would want to export its model of the internet, highly surveilled model, like they're integrating drone information and providing all kinds of ways to make surveillance capability even stronger. And I suspect that they would want to export this model to countries that actually could get a real jump start and go from low tech to high tech very quickly, and especially if governments are so inclined. Do you think India is in a position to think about exporting its vision of the internet to the rest of the world? Because these are new ideas and I haven't seen them discussed and fleshed out to the extent that I have in India. I mean, this stuff that you're talking about has been in the works for at least 6 or 7 years, I suspect. Right, this whole thinking around fiduciaries and account aggregators. And like you said, it's complex. It takes time to get your head around it. But now that we're approaching light, possibly at the end of the tunnel, that this stuff can actually work, do you see this as something that India can actually export as an innovator in this space to the rest of the world?
Oh, absolutely. And the conversations are happening now. It's early days yet. And once we have something really working at scale, then we'll have facts on the ground to back it up. But many countries have been talking about it. We think this is one more way of creating a more egalitarian internet. I mean, you can talk about antitrust, you can talk about all the other stuff, but that's all regulatory and that's up to governments. But how do you provide technological alternatives where data is flipped around? That I don't think anybody has thought through to the level we have. So yes, there's a lot of interest. Many countries are talking about it. It requires a lot of things to fall into place, right? You have to have intent. You need to have regulators and bureaucrats who understand this, political will, and technology guys in those countries who are willing to work on implementing this complicated stuff. That's why it takes time. It's not easy to propagate as that fast.
Do you think it has some scope in the US as well, or is the US just too far along in terms of its ad model of the internet? Or do you think that US regulators should actually take a breather and say, should we rethink data and internet model along the lines that India is doing? Or do you think the US is just too far along?
Well, I think you're already seeing a lot of changes in the ad model with some of the requirements of the platforms to opt in on tracking and so on. So I think the ad model is going through a lot of changes. And in fact, I would believe that a lot of the future, even in the US, is going to be transaction oriented and not ad oriented. We can see that in the direction of most of the big tech players. But I think this best works in regulated areas. That's why our focus is on financial data, which is all regulated, healthcare data, which is all regulated, and so on. So I think while the general area of what you're doing on the internet and that stuff is probably, as you said, pretty advanced, I think in areas like financial services or healthcare and so on, you can use this to unlock a lot of benefit for people.
Cool. That's been an interesting tour, Nandan. I just want to segue into some of your other activities. You've been involved in education and building the XStep platform for education. Tell us a little bit more about that vision that you have for bringing technology to educate people who actually don't have the means or the access. Tell us a little bit more about that platform and how you're using tech in the primary education space.
Yeah, sure. So just to step back a bit, basically, as you know, I have two hats. One is the private sector hat. I worked at Infosys for a very long time. Then I took a break for 8 years and essentially worked in the government and with NPCI and built this stuff. And then I went back as the chairman of Infosys, which I still am. So I have the private sector hat. And then there's been the public hat, which initially began by building public infrastructure in the government. And I was involved with the Aadhaar, the DBT, the whole India stack, which is really all these layers, UPI with NPCI, data empowerment. I also came up with the original design of the GST infrastructure for tax collection and the RFID tag system for the country for streamlining movement of vehicles along highways and so on. So I've done a lot of this public stuff. And then in 2014, when I stepped down from the government, I wanted to do something, but wanted to do it more in a philanthropic and sort of a non-profit capacity. That's how my wife Rohini, I, and our friend Shankar Marwada set up XStep. This actually came out of a conversation that Rohini and I had in Boston. We were in Boston for some graduation or something. We were in Boston. And I had taken Rohini to edX, which is this platform that Harvard and MIT have put together for education. And she said, why can't you do something similar for children? And, at that time, I'd just come off the Aadhaar project, and I was only used to think about millions of people and all that. So I said, how big is the problem? She said, 200 million children. I said, that's good enough for me. I just am greedy for these large problems. So that's how XStep was set up. And we tried a lot of things. We thought it was about building a cool app on a phone and all, but then we realized it's much deeper than that. And I think over the last several years, we have worked on that and come up with, again, it's a completely open source project. We have all the technology on GitHub called Sunbird. It's really the digital infrastructure for learning, which you can then combine and mix and match and do things. And we are very fortunate that the Indian government was embarking on a major program on using technology for learning called Diksha, and they were able to leverage the components of Sunbird. So today, and that became very useful in the pandemic because the schools were not open. So now it's being used by teachers, children. Textbooks have QR codes, so they connect the digital to the physical. It's more than a solution or an app. It's really infrastructure which you can then configure in different ways. And that, we think, actually has a huge impact on what we can do in learning.
Where's that now? Like, how many kids in India are using it? What are you seeing in terms of usage and impact?
At this point, it's probably more teachers than kids, because the first challenge was getting the teachers training and so on. So millions of teachers have used it for getting certified, upgrading their skills, and so on, because children don't have devices. In terms of interactions, it probably has more than 1 billion interactions on it. And it's across the country, in every state, in every language, in every textbook. Maybe there are about 600 million textbooks today with QR codes in them. So it's pretty much at scale, but it's not yet child self-service in that sense. It's more teacher and child assisted.
Is the vision that it would become ultimately child self-service?
I mean, that depends on devices and so on. But yeah, I mean, there's nothing in the architecture which would prevent it from being self-service. This is also another area where we are seeing a lot of global interest. We recently, along with the Ministry of External Affairs, HRD Ministry and World Bank, had a seminar in Africa. And there's a lot of interest because every country is looking at how to bring in tech into education at scale.
Cool. So that's another potential export.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, actually, if you want to look at India's public digital infrastructure, there are many things. Number one, of course, there is open source implementation of ID called MOSIP, which has been built in India by IIIT. And that's being implemented in Philippines and Morocco. And The World Bank is looking at about 20 countries where that could go. So that's one. NPCI has set up something called NPCI Global to take its payment infrastructure globally and is in talks with multiple countries. The data empowerment architecture, at least 5-6 countries are evaluating it and seeing how it fits into what they're doing. The Sunbird infrastructure on learning is also possible export. And the latest one actually is something which another foundation that I'm involved with called eGov Foundation has built, which is the digital vaccination certificate called DVOC. And this is a verifiable certificate using W3C standards. And it's being used in India. And today, the 150 million digital certificates have been produced for every vaccination. And this certificate is digital. It's digital signed. It's encrypted. It has a QR code.
So how does that work? Like you go get a vaccination and what happens?
Oh, you get a vaccination and you enter the details of your name, your where you got the vaccination, which one you got, Pfizer, Moderna, Oxford, what date, all that. And it instantly generates a digital certificate, which you can get on your smartphone, or you can put it into the digital locker on the cloud, or you can get a hard copy of it. And it has a QR code on it. So you can authenticate that certificate, which is very important because now people are beginning to realize that, there are a lot of people going around with fake certificates. And now suppose somebody boards a plane with a certificate and you have a requirement that he be vaccinated, how do you know that certificate is real, right? So this is the problem that people are now facing. So we solved that by creating this digitally encrypted certificate with a QR code on it. And again, Dr. Pramod Verma, who was the chief architect of Aadhaar, was involved in designing this, built by eGov Foundation. And that, by the way, is many countries are now looking at it because everybody's realizing that this vaccination certificate is whether it's authentic or not is going to be a big challenge. We sort of anticipated that. So that's another export, if you will, from India.
That's all very cool. And you obviously have a really crackerjack tech team behind you. You mentioned Pramod and others. And I would guess that these people have had a really major impact in shaping tech in India.
Oh, yeah. So these are exceptionally brilliant people. And also, Dr. Pramod is, of course, super brilliant, one of the best architects in the world. And we have Dr. Vivek Raghavan, who is one of the best AI guys today anywhere. We have Shankar, who's a phenomenal leader of XStep. So, we have many people. And the good thing is that they're all believers in how do we use tech at scale for good. And they come with the right motives. They're all people who have been there, done that, built companies, made money, and now would rather spend their time doing something meaningful for society. Yeah, many people who are in our group.
Yeah, and it shows because you need that dedication. Other than the talent itself, you need a mindset. And every time I meet people in your team, it's obvious that there's a lot of social thinking and social good that goes into thinking about these, how to develop tools at scale, because if there's one thing in India you need, it's stuff to work at scale.
Now, one of the things that Dr. Vivek Raghavan is a great case. Vivek is, he's IIT Delhi. You also IIT Delhi, right? So he's a junior of yours.
I am, yes.
He's a junior of yours from IIT Delhi, PhD from Carnegie Mellon, did 2-3 startups. Brilliant guy. And he's working on AI for India and done some amazing work. For example, the Supreme Court of India uses natural language, neural machine translations based open source platform that XStep has built, and they are able to translate 9 Indian languages to English and back and forth. And it's trained for judicial documents. So it could be a judgment or a witness statement or whatever. And this is very important if you want to improve the speed of the judicial system, because a big part of that is documents in different languages which need to be translated. And this same open source tech is now been used in Bangladesh, one more example of export, where the Bangladesh Supreme Court is using it for Bangla documents. And now XStep is partnering with the government on a natural language translation mission and trying to see how do we create an open set of models and data for Indian languages so that we can translate from any Indian language to any Indian language, speech, text, whatever. So that's another part. Now it's some of this all AI stuff also.
Mind-boggling, isn't it? Who would have thunk this 10 years ago, right? That you would have one language to another. I mean, I remember having these conversations with you about, where are we in AI? Like, what's really going on? And AI has gone through many winters, but I'm just amazed at the kind of progress I've seen, just in the last 5 years. It just blows my mind. How you can have these tools that can be completely language agnostic. It doesn't matter what it is. They still work out of the box. Sort of AI really come to life in our lifetimes.
And Vasant, one is the AI, but what we're trying to do, and government has been very supportive, is how do we harness the collective strength of private companies, universities, government spending, global players, and how do we have a systematic way of having library of models, library of data which is open, which everybody can consume, everybody contributes, and everybody consumes. So this is, if we can do this, then in 2 years, there'll be such an advanced data models for Indian languages that it'll be quite spectacular if it all works out.
It's amazing. You've always been a tech guy and focused on platforms and scale. And now combining that with progress in AI just completely boggles my mind. It makes me wonder what the next 50 years will look like. We're not going to be around that long, but I've always been an optimist. So I feel that, we're in for quite a ride here. And, folks like you had a major impact in shaping it. So thanks for joining and sharing your thoughts and expertise. People tune into this show from all over the world. So I think it'd be interesting for them to hear of all the cool stuff that's been going on in India and how it could really shape humanity in the next decade or two. So thanks a lot.
Thank you, Vasant. And, I'm really honored to be on this show. I've seen all the great people you've brought, and it's a privilege to be counted among them as one of your guests.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. And it's been a pleasure, as usual. It's been too long since we've seen each other face to face, but I hope that changes soon.
That jazz bar in Bleecker Street or whatever. I'm waiting.
That's right. The Zinc Bar, the best kept jazz secret in New York City. I'm surprised.
No, now everybody heard about it on this program.
Indeed. All right, Nandan. Thanks again, and we'll be in touch.
Great. Take care, Vasant.
You too. Bye.